Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, ready for Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis and ready for Radio Liberty's media manager here in Washington, D.C. Uzbek authorities have been bragging about of opening of great reform process in the country since 2016. Well, if there was any desire for a genuine opening, this has certainly not touched one area that is the crucial indicator of any open society. I'm talking about the ability of independent NGOs operating in the country without the state's interference. This situation is so dire that this is almost impossible to get an independent NGO registered, where running an NGO without a registration can make one liable for persecution. In one of our earlier conversations, an Uzbek activist told us on this platform that one NGO has attempted 18 times to get the organization registered, but registration was still denied. So on today's Majlis podcast, we are here to discuss the challenges of the NGO world and the stories of their survival in Uzbekistan. To do so, I'm joined by Dilmurad Yusupov, a researcher at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, Steve Swerdlow, human rights lawyer and associate professor of the practice of human rights at the University of Southern California, Dilmira Matyakubova, co-director of Uz Investigations and a fellow at the London-based Foreign Policy Center, and Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Liberty Central Asia blog Kishlok Owazi. Welcome on board, colleagues. So the NGO world, I don't even know where to start this conversation. So my knowledge is kind of limited with what Uzbek officials have been bragging about this when they happen to be in Washington, D.C. And they say there are over 10,000 NGOs currently operating in the country. This is a significant number. But you guys and some other activists say this claim couldn't be further from the truth. So let's start with the most knowledgeable person among us, I guess, Dilmurad. You were actually involved in efforts to get NGOs registered in Uzbekistan. So tell us your story.
Yes, unfortunately, I think the 10,000 number is not close to the truth, because I think not so many NGOs actually in Uzbekistan, and we need to distinguish first between two types of NGOs mainly, which is also in line with the available research on NGOs and civil society in Uzbekistan. So the first type is government-organized NGOs, or GONGOs, how we call them. And the second type is self-initiative NGOs, or samoinitiativные ННО, how they call it in Uzbekistan. So according to the estimates, more than 6,000 of NGOs are GONGOs, so they are government-organized NGOs, and only less than 3,000 NGOs are self-initiatives, or they were registered based on the initiative of citizens themselves, not the government. And another important issue here is the 10,000 number includes all of the branches. So we have so many branches of GONGOs. For example, the Women's Committee of Uzbekistan or the Youth Union. The Women's Committee now is merged with the Ministry for Support of Mahalla and Family. But before they had about 200 branches across the country. So each branch is referred to as a separate NGO, even if they are representing a headquarter in Tashkent in the region, so they are considered as a separate NGO, a legal entity. And this is against the international standard.
So let's say if your organization is registered in Tashkent, let's hope for that good day. So if that's registered, then you want to open a branch in Bukhara or branch in Andijan or places like that. So each of those branches are going to be counted as a separate NGO and would have been part of this 10,000 that Uzbek authorities are bragging about. Correct?
Exactly, yeah. This is the truth. So we have, I call this a multiplier effect, when we have like 10,000 NGOs, where this number comes from. This comes from, again, the counting all these legal entities, like branches of GONGOs across the country. And I think that the number should be 3,000 something of NGOs in the country, not counting all these legal representative offices of these GONGOs.
Very interesting. So this 3,000 that you're talking about, let's focus on that for a minute. So the 3,000 NGOs that are independent NGOs that are operating in Uzbekistan. So the process seems to be very, very delicate, full of confusion, like the process of registering an independent NGO. I know when I heard that you have attempted to, or at least was part of this process to get an NGO registered in Uzbekistan. So how this process looks like, If you have gone through this process of registration, so tell us, how does this work? I mean, how we end up one application being denied 18 times?
Yeah, this is a very serious question because we're still struggling with the registration issue because many self-initiative groups, like grassroots groups, are struggling, especially human rights groups are still struggling to get the registration done. And I myself have been involved in the registration process of one NGO, which I'm always talking about, is Altun Qanot, which is translated as Golden Wing. It's a youth volunteer center. And they have been trying to register since, I think, November 2018. And received already more than 21 rejections in registration.
So your NGO holds the record, 20. Wow.
21, yeah. Wow. So I asked them why it's happening. So I just want to understand, is it humane to receive 21 rejections? If these guys want to do good for the society, they are volunteering, they are young people, they are students, what's the problem here? It's not a political organization or something else. And I don't know what's happening here, but my hypothesis is that many self-initiative groups, like self-initiative organizations, some spheres are regulated by the government. For example, youth activity is regulated by Gongo Youth Union of Uzbekistan. And if a self-initiative group wants to interfere, wants to penetrate that field of activity, they may face some resistance because it's already regulated by the government. So you don't need to go there. And I have a feeling that they also got something from the youth union saying, okay, you can be part of us, but you don't need to create a separate organization. So the registration issue is very complex. It's not only bureaucratic or red tape issue. It's deeper, I think.
Yeah. No, I'm intrigued by this earth-shaking objective that this organization, this youth-led organization might have, which you are trying to register. I mean, what they are trying to do so that the Uzbek authorities are so opposed to registering this organization.
The objective is to unite young volunteers. So we also have a law on volunteering.
So this is sensitive for the authorities?
I don't know why. It shouldn't be sensitive. I'm not sure what Steve and Dilmira say about this, but my take is that they are interfering into the field of interest of another organization, which is controlled by the government. And the interesting thing, I can make a comparison here. The Association of Volunteers of Uzbekistan was registered in one go. So it was registered last year, at the end of last year, and they just submitted the documents only once. Why they are registering the organization in one go and why this group is facing 21 rejections. I don't understand why. And it's happening.
Perhaps you can guess what the fate of 22nd application or attempt might be. Steve, you have the background of working in the human rights sector in Uzbekistan. Perhaps you have gone through some of the experiences that we are talking about with Dilmurat. How unusual or common is this storyline that Dilmurat has shared with us when compared with the registration experience of other NGOs that you might have been part of?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, of course, I haven't been involved in forming a local organization like Dilmurad, but, when I was with Human Rights Watch earlier, in some ways, the experiences that really shaped me initially when I was working on human rights in Uzbekistan was the tortuous process of, I remember quite vividly walking over to the Ministry of Justice on a daily basis, asking about not the registration, but the accreditation in that case for a representative of a foreign international human rights organization, Human Rights Watch at the time. And that was, very much during Karima's rule. And having the feeling that government was playing games, was monitoring our activities, not just physical surveillance, but it's these bureaucratic obstacles, the various games which are played with the charters that organizations draw up in their applications. The comma is not here, the comma should go there, the stamp is not correct, the translation is inaccurate. These various bureaucratic obstacles were a way to suck our time away, detract us from what we needed to do, which was work on defending human rights. And if that was the experience of an international organization, I can only imagine how frustrating and difficult it is for local organizations. And so the organizations, you asked about human rights groups, we have Agzam Turgunov, a former political prisoner who's registered now, I think, around 9 times. He's based in Tashkent. We also have Shuhrat Ganiyev, a very well-respected expert in Bukhara, who for years hasn't been able to get registration. And in addition to that, we have in Karakalpakstan a group working on forced labor called Chirok, which has also been denied registration. So there you have this, unfortunately, this pattern which doesn't seem to be changing despite a really lengthy chorus of voices for many years, including the Human Rights Committee of the UN, which just April last year again underlined the importance that Uzbekistan live up to its basic obligations under Article 19, Article 22, Article 25 of the Covenant of Civil and Political Rights to make it possible to form these organizations.
A very interesting point there, Steve. You spoke about the registration attempts in other cities outside of Tashkent. And maybe, Dilmira, you could jump in here. Are the obstacles that we are talking about today with the NGO that Dilmurat was trying to register and the experience that Steve has shared with us, are those obstacles the same in every region of Uzbekistan? Let's say how the registration process is compared between Tashkent or let's say Samarkand, the president's hometown, how they are compared.
Well, thank you very much for, first of all. And Dilmurad has got it exactly right. But I don't think it depends on the kind of the regions where the initiatives are coming from, but the types of it. So I think the types of the NGO they're trying to form, which is independent from the state. So in this case, anything independent from state is almost impossible to form. Well, as the practice shows, and as Dilmurad and Steve already have mentioned, we are observing a variety of initiatives that are being refused. For instance, the youth organization, as Dilmurad mentioned. I don't know what the motive and rationale behind that refusing onto that organization, but I know that I've been following the initiatives that are formed by former political prisoners. For instance, Akzam Turgunov has been trying to he's submitted the charter 8 times now. Every time, interesting that the Ministry of Justice, it comes up with a different kind of reason, just for the refusal. The first time they said, okay, so you have to indicate how many initiators you're going to have in your NGO. And then the second time, okay, they followed everything, they gathered people. So basically they listened to all the whatever remarks the ministry made. And the second time, so there was very, very silly and very kind of a ridiculous comment they came up with. It wasn't numbered. The charter is not shown. It's like you have to put numbers here. So it's very, very, very technical reasons. And it's clear that they don't want to register this organization because it's being formed by former political prisoners. And they haven't even been, acquitted, meaning their false accusations in the past for which they've been imprisoned and served like decades of time in prisons. That hasn't been accepted by the government, and said, okay, these people were imprisoned wrongly, falsely. No, of course, then they wouldn't open anything they're gonna, the organization they're gonna register. They're trying to register. So the point is that it depends on the type of the initiation. If it is non-state, independent, especially if it's a political organization, formed by the political prisoners or any political actors. It's very.
Dilmurad is not. Dilmurad is not a political activist. The NGO that he is trying to register is just a very innocent type of activity that they are planning on engaging.
My guess is for that. I think because so it's a youth organization. The government has its own kind of youth organization. As the association that Dilmurad mentioned was formed very quickly. It was at first attempt, and that is governmental. That's why. And what that is mean that because the government knows these people and that they have hired them themselves and they want to work with them, which means these are regime loyalists. They know the system. They know there's a lack of transparency. If anyone beyond the regime comes, I want to work, I want to form an NGO. No. They're very, very skeptical about people from outside because they know that if they're going to investigate them, they're going to find out that they're a dirty, murky world of corruption. Of course, they're afraid. They're cautious. Anyone outside the regime. Well, I think at least that's mine.
Bruce, Bruce, you would like to jump in here? I mean, as a regional observer looking to Uzbekistan from outside, but what do you see? What's at play here? I mean, although I have to be very clear here, I don't condone it, but I can understand if someone is trying to get the registration for an NGO would be, let's say, working on the like LGBTQ types of gender issues, you could understand maybe there might be some sensitivities involved in that, like LGBTQ is still kind of a sensitive topic in countries like Uzbekistan. Yeah, again, I have to be clear that I don't condone. I mean, every NGOs and people, citizens have all the rights to establish any NGO that they desire to establish. So what do you see is at play here, Bruce? I mean, one volunteer organization gets registered in one day and the other is facing 21 rejections. What's at play here?
Well, I think as all our guests really kind of hinted, it's strange that they don't seem to want any organization that's truly independent and separated from the government. And this is problematic for a lot of reasons, because there's a lot of people who would form an NGO or some kind of volunteer initiative group, whatever you want to call it, that would for good purposes. I mean, the pandemic, I'm sure there was people that would have formed their own volunteer organizations to help out a lot, like we saw in Kyrgyzstan. Dilmurad works a lot with people with disabilities and stuff. And this would be another one where it would just only augment whatever efforts the government is making to help out these kind of people. But they get trapped up, find these difficulties because the government's afraid if they register them, it sets a precedent for groups that focus on rights or LGBT, like you were saying, or other issues that the government doesn't want to have any independent group dealing with. And so, like I said, it's impossible for the government to separate an independent group, NGO at that point, even though some would actually, I mean, all of them, I would say, would probably benefit the country. But some represent no threat to the government whatsoever. But if they register them, then they have a foot in the door. And all of a sudden it becomes really hard to justify why you're not registering other groups, with a different focus, a different object, but still an NGO, a true NGO.
Can I add to something that Bruce just said, Muhammad?
Sure.
I remember when Senator Sadiq Safayev came to the Atlantic Council in Washington a few months ago, or more than a few months ago at this point. He was making a presentation about Uzbekistan and how it's fared under COVID-19. And I am sure that I remember correctly that the first statement that he made was that the partnership with civil society, meaning with NGOs, is what actually allowed Uzbekistan to avoid, I think he said, the worst consequences or worst effects of COVID-19. It was a very skillful way of trying to show recognition of the importance of the role of civil society. And it was quite ironic, given everything we've just been discussing, which is that I think, again, at some level, people in the government understand that civil society is absolutely essential to any sort of steps forward here. And yet there still seems to be whoever is really in control, the side that doesn't want to see free registration, unfortunately, is still winning.
Yeah, maybe the word bragging might be strong here. I'm just using again and again when I describe the way the Uzbek authorities propagate those types of things, the types of which you were talking about, Steve, referring to Senator Safayev. But the reality is, I mean, as we are talking about, it's just so complicated. It's just that those types of announcement does not really reflect what the ground truth is. Maybe, Steve, you could jump in. Just one quick point that I wanted to raise here before we move on. The difference between the registration process between the capital, the regions. I mean, it has been often the case in Central Asia and some other places. Like there are some striking differences when it comes to how bureaucracy works between one city to the other. So is there any comparison to be drawn between Tashkent and the, let's say, Bukhara, Samarkand, or maybe Andijan, let's say?
I think it is an aspect of this issue that we sometimes don't always discuss enough. I was speaking with an activist who works in the Fergana Valley, who runs a group on women's rights, and they help victims of domestic violence. And they're one of the most competent, professional, experienced, just amazing groups in the entire country. And yet I asked them about another case of domestic violence that occurred in a neighboring province in Andijan. There's been a big news in the last few weeks about a woman that was tragically raped by a group of men, and a terrible case. And I asked this activist, could you take on that case in Andijan? You're the best person to provide help to this woman. And she said, it's dangerous. If you stick your nose into another region and you don't have full national, full Republican registration, your head chopped off. You can really face serious problems. And so that, again, points to even those that are registered are often in this position of not knowing whether or not they're crossing the line. And I think that speaks to the general uncertainty and fear and the need for, again, serious reform.
Very interesting.
I wanted to also add here, I agree with Steve that there are many restrictions remaining from the previous period regarding the area of operation of one NGO. For example, if an NGO is registered at Tashkent City Department of Justice, it can only work within Tashkent City. It even cannot go out of the Tashkent City to Tashkent region, for example, to work there with some of the beneficiaries there. So, and it's also punishable if you are going to work with an NGO in another region, as if it's another country. So you should imagine yourself that you're going to another region, like to another country. But we propose this to remove this restriction because if you are registered in Uzbekistan, you should be able to work everywhere in Uzbekistan. And in the new code on NGOs, the civil society activists, they propose to remove this restriction on geographical area of operation. So,
in this situation, I cannot even imagine the type of challenges one might face running an NGO without a registration. Any thoughts?
Well, a lot of activists have done it for many years, and we've talked about, we lost recently an activist that Bruce and I wrote about, Surati Kramov, who died earlier in May, who for almost 20 years did heroic work collecting stories of torture and religious persecution in Uzbekistan. We have, of course, Yelena Orlaeva, who goes out and protests without registration, and many others. And of course, in some ways, this strange equilibrium has formed over the years where there's this reticent acceptance by the government that unregistered activists do exist. And yet the tragedy, I think, is more in that those activists that have the most experience in these issues, especially with the criminal justice system, like Yelena Orlaeva, like the late Surati Kramov, and now Aksam Turgunov, who's struggling for registration, they don't get invited to the conversations inside parliament. They don't get invited into those more officialdom where they should have a voice in forming policy.
But do they also get in trouble for running an NGO without registration?
I think in earlier periods of time, we saw prosecutions happening in the aftermath of Andijan along those lines. But as I said, there's sort of strange equilibrium developed over the last decade where there's sort of, an acceptance that they exist. Although certainly the right to protest is very much still a dangerous one. Yeah. And, we see people detained and harassed pretty regularly.
Harassed and beaten up.
I can also add here about the informality of working as an NGO informally. Your capabilities will be really restricted because you will not be able to work with international organizations. You will not be able to receive, officially grants because you can only open an account to your own name in the bank. You can't have an organization bank account. And you will not be able to hold official events or something else. So
if you do, what happens?
I'm not sure if you do, but there can be some repercussions about this. But I've never heard about this.
Okay. So what's the real problem here? How can NGO communities navigate these challenges, and where the international community factors in or can tune in to be of help? Let's continue the conversation talking about these and many other questions very shortly. First, let me recap the debate that today on the Majlis podcast, I'm joined by Steve Severlu, human rights lawyer and associate professor of the practice of human rights at the University of Southern California, Dilmira Mat-Yakubova, co-director of US Investigations and a fellow at the London-based Foreign Policy Center, Dilmurat Yusupov, a researcher at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, and Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Europe Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi. I'm Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free Europe Liberties media manager and host of the Majlis podcast here in Washington, D.C., and we are discussing the challenges of the NGO community in Uzbekistan. So, Mirziyoyev and the high-level Uzbek officials, like the types of whom, as Steve earlier you were referring to in the case of Senator Safayev, when they are outside, like in platforms like the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., they say that the discussions about deliberate obstacles are not honest. And you guys say the challenges are real. So something is missing there. So what's the likely missing piece in this puzzle?
I'd say it's the outsized influence of the security services, as in with, also the barriers that we see being applied to the registration of opposition parties as we get closer to the elections, some of the problems faced by the first independent trade union that was formed, and of course, in the recent days, the problems that our colleague Agnieszka Pikulitska, the journalist from Al Jazeera, in the denial of her accreditation is experiencing. There seems to be this contingent of a powerful elite that is scared by independent, critical discussions happening. And I think that in order to overcome that, I think there needs to be, again, in unison, the international community needs to get behind the human rights defenders that are trying to register organizations and just stay the course and make sure that there's a connection between the continued pattern of denial of registration and potentially some adverse consequences, economically or politically.
And I guess the one missing point here is, is this denial of NGO registration or any registration, like in the case of the journalists that you are referring to, is this a systematic thing there? Or this is the act of some individuals who are still not in line with the progress that Uzbek top leadership are saying is happening in Uzbekistan?
I think it's a combination. Of course, power is concentrated in the person of the president. And the human rights community is calling on him to uphold the rights that exist in the Constitution and live up to Uzbekistan's international obligations. I think it would take some political capital to push back against the security services. I think what we've seen, or at least, and I'd be interested to hear if Dilmurad and Dilmira agree with this, and Bruce, that 2017, 2018 in some ways were more of a high watermark of momentum on reforms. And I think the onset of COVID, and as we inch towards these elections, we seem to again see this sliding back into authoritarian habits. Of course, we also have to mention the imprisonment of the journalist for 6.5 years down in Termez, Atabek Satori, which you talked about last week. But I think all of these things, it requires, yes, the security services are powerful, but ultimately this system is about really one leader. And I think he needs to get on the right side.
Dilmrat, any thoughts, or Bruce, any thoughts on that? I mean, what I'm just wondering is often whenever we talk about Uzbekistan, they say, okay, president has lots of good intentions in mind, but there are some individuals who just don't know the official line put forward by the president or things like that. So what I'm saying is, in terms of this specific case of NGO registration, is this denial, the 21 times of denial for the organization that you are trying to get registered, Dilmurad, is this denial a systematic practice there, or there are some individuals within the system, within the Justice Department, who are creating all the obstacles against this NGO that you are trying to register?
Yeah, I think from my own point, my own experience, I think it's a systematic issue, and the system hasn't changed. And so I was talking about this. There can be some cosmetic changes in the discourse, in the presenting the civil society. I also don't deny there were some positive changes, and for example, the financial support to the NGOs and other many positive changes happening. But the system hasn't changed, the systematic way of registering NGOs, because the procedures for registration are still governed by the 2014 decree, which was adopted during the Karimov era, so it hasn't changed. And the procedures are the same. And there was a really good decree adopted by President Mirziyoyev in May 2018. It was all about explicitly talking about all these difficulties and barriers for development of the civil society institutions, the importance of these civil society institutions in the democratic kind of renewal of the country. But I think many of these decrees are really good, but the implementation by the Ministry of Justice or by all other organizations behind the Ministry of Justice, it's very slow, very cautious, I think. Rather than believing or trusting in the potential of the civil society, they are trying to control it. So I always say about this, rather than developing social kind of partnership with NGOs and civil society institutions, they are more in favor of control, strict control.
Interesting.
And one more indicator is that we have been struggling with the civil society organizations for adoption of the new NGO code for more than 2 years now. And last year in January, the Ministry of Justice presented a draft. It was severely criticized by the civil society activists. They proposed their own versions, alternative versions of the NGO code, and it should have been adopted by August last year, or at least published for discussion. But it hasn't happened yet. So what is the problem there? I don't really understand.
It is. It's so interesting situation. Like, I guess before COVID, the Uzbek Justice Minister was here in Washington D.C. and we, along other activists, we had quite a long conversation with him. He sounded to be very smart guy, well spoken, articulate, and I can guess that the guy might have been gone to school during Karimov era, but again, the way he takes questions, the way he speaks, the way he presents his ideas, certainly he has way more kind of a broader background in this sector. I just wonder, why is it that the authorities are not getting the contribution that an active civil society can make in the advancement of the country, advancement of the progress that they keep talking about? I mean, Bruce, is there any particular thought that you could add in response to this?
Yeah, well, and just following up on what you were asking Dilmurad a minute ago too, that there's what the government says and what Mirziyoyev says, and then what actually happens. And we've seen it not only with the NGOs, but with the trying to end forced labor in the cotton fields and other things. It's clear that what he says, we're going to loosen the space for NGOs, or we got to get rid of forced labor. And he says that publicly, really, it seems for international consumption. But there's obviously orders in the back room about meeting quotas or not registering groups or things like that. It's hard for me to believe that if Mirziyoyev was serious about this and pursued it, that this stuff would not get changed much more quickly than it actually does. But, then we have these lower level officials that always end up getting, they're the fall guys for this stuff. When it does come out, they catch them and say, well, here this guy wasn't obeying Mirziyoyev's orders. And if it only happened once or twice, then you could say, okay, there's a couple bad apples that just are resistant to the kind of change and stuff. But I mean, it really happens across the board. I mean, there's dozens of people that are getting caught for these kind of things over the last 5 years. And it's clear that it's not changing much. And like I said, you have to conclude at the end that, there's an order that goes out to everybody, much more quietly that tells them that these are the actual rules. You would have heard what the president said or somebody said on TV or what was written in the newspaper, and that's fine. But the real rules are this, That's why this stuff keeps going. It's clearly systemic.
Yeah.
And like I said, if Mirziyoyev was real serious about this stuff, and he has been, let's face it, I mean, forced labor is one of those things that you can point to and say that it got better, and he was looking at it, and it, there was significant progress. And then you look at what he says about registering NGOs or political parties, and there's no progress there. At all. I mean, you can already see that if he really wanted to push some of this stuff through, there shouldn't be any problem pushing it through. I don't agree, when people say, well, it's just a couple of officials that are resistant to change. It's more than a couple of officials, and there really is no genuine efforts in some of these cases to make changes.
Right. In the question of what to do about this, I mean, one other issue, perhaps Dilmira, you might jump in here, the Uzbek authorities keeps bragging about is the emerging plurality in the press freedom, although I have so many questions about that too. So are these challenges, that the type of challenge that we are talking about, NGO registration today, are they highlighted in local media? Are they talking about this?
Well, I think there was one or two articles about these challenges on registering NGOs, but not really deep critical kind of pieces. I mean, how I see it, I mean, we've been talking about the regime and that the system hasn't changed. I want to agree with that argument that, for me, there was never a dialogue between the state and the society. That's why, the government does not believe the civil society that it can contribute. It has goodwill. It wants to make a difference and make a lot of good things. That's first is because the regime is built on the faith that this is a security state run by the police that believes that the power and control is the main thing, and that to keep the stability of the regime, they have to keep their own legitimacy. That legitimacy is also supported by all kinds of these NGOs, Dilmurad mentioned. There's the NGOs that are like kind of making difference. They are serving as NGOs, but they're not really for people. They're not initiated by people. They're initiated by the system. Well, how I see it, again, it's just how Turkmenistan, for instance, let's say after Niyazev. So what's expected, would there be any political change? Would there be like the sprouting number of NGOs? No, that didn't happen. The same goes for Uzbekistan, basically. It's just after Karimov, Shavkat Mirziyoyev came, and it was prime minister at the time, was basically one of the architects of the dictatorship. And why should we expect something different from it?
Yeah.
Why should we expect like spreading of NGOs from this, or civil society or something?
But when you ask the authorities, they don't like to be compared with Turkmenistan.
Oh yeah, they don't like it, but it's going that way. I mean, it's no different for me. If you ask me, it's just modernizing authoritarianism. Well, as we had the discourse at the beginning of the journey, right? We were arguing that this is just a modernizing authoritarianism, nothing different. It's just the same regime. But there was another, like a different kinds of variety of experts arguing that no, this is democratizing system. It's just completely different from Karimov. What are you talking about? So they were arguing fiercely with us that there is liberalization. Yes, there is liberalization, but it's just economic. It's not political. It's not democratic. It's nothing. It has nothing to do with democracy.
One other area which really reflects the bottom line of what you are trying to say, Dilmira, here is the comparison, Dilmurat, you have drawn in your recent the diplomat interview. No, there was another point that Dilmurat has raised in terms of in which Dilmurat, you compared the number of NGOs in Uzbekistan with some of its neighbors. I think that there's a good lesson to be learned about the place in where Uzbekistan is currently, although they keep bragging about the progress.
I can add one most thing, please. That is very important because it just basically explains the nature of regime and why is it not changing and why it won't change as far as there are these people. Well, if you think about this authoritarian repression, we normally think about North Korea, China, Russia. No. If you look at the facts, if you look at the the latest research, the number of cases of exile repression, this transnational repression, Uzbekistan is on the top. It has 195 cases of exiles facing various kinds of repression, all kinds, torture, arrest, and every kinds. Yeah. And North Korea, China, Turkey are the four comes after Uzbekistan. And so that tells something about the nature of the regime. I think that's how we should treat this regime.
Yeah, very, very interesting points there. Dilmurat, of course, we need to wrap up the discussion very, very shortly here.
I wanted to respond to your question earlier. Why the government is not allowing the freedom of NGOs, and I think there are two reasons for this.
Please be brief, Dilmurat. We need to wrap up the conversation.
Yes, the first one is the fear, because we are seeing, for example, Kyrgyzstan and Belarus and other countries, so there is a strong fear of independent organizations. And the second one is if NGOs are doing the job of the government, so there is a complementary job that's done by NGOs. So the government is afraid that it will lose its reputation in front of the population. So they don't want to give the opportunity to NGOs to work. So this was just a feeling from the response to the COVID pandemic. Because initially, as Steve was also mentioning, it was civil society activists who started helping the population. But then on 1st of April, they stopped these by creating a single center for allocation of social support. So I think that these are two reasons for not allowing.
The fear factor is interesting there. I mean, of course, it's questionable, but without having an NGO, they are also losing a lot. Independent NGOs can contribute a lot to the betterment of the society. But is there anything can be done about this situation? What I'm kind of have in mind is, I don't like to expand the conversation here, but just maybe last point. Earlier, we have seen that the international pressure kind of worked in some ways. There was a huge issue with the forced cotton labor, Steve, and I know you are very much aware of the type of situation that I'm trying to highlight here. And then there was a campaign to eradicate the forced labor. And it looks like we see some sort of an improvement in this situation. And that was, I guess, to the greater extent due to the campaign run by coalition of NGOs internationally. And it looks like in some ways international pressure can make a difference. Do you see a place in where, the international community can play a role in this NGO registration process here?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, without any doubt, without international pressure, we wouldn't have seen the political prisoners, the individual prisoners released that we saw. We wouldn't have seen a reduction in forced and child labor. I think, yes, in some ways, it's harder in a way to conceptualize this as an issue. I don't want to use the term, that it's not as sexy or somehow not as dramatic to talk about, eyelids start to drop when we talk about registration hurdles and bureaucracy. It's not the same as saying that, kids are out in the fields, or people are being tortured in the jails. That is a more emotional, that connects with, I think, your interlocutor, your diplomat in Geneva that you're trying to move than an NGO story. And that's why I think the work that Dilmurod and Dilmira are doing is so important in the way that they're painting the picture of the actual contributions that these organizations make on a day-to-day basis. If we can show that women will be subjected to domestic violence less frequently, or there will be fewer homeless, or there will be a way to react to torture more quickly, if you can show that NGOs are critical to defending rights, then I think it becomes a lot more concrete and we can start to form a campaign. I did want to, Mohammed, be fair. I went up and I looked up the list of the organizations that have been registered. I want to make sure to at least note that, and it's a short list, unfortunately, but IREX, the international organization I used to work for, got registered in the last year. Winrock International, which works on women's rights and development, got registered. This Association for Central Asia, which seems to be Uzbek run from Sweden and is related to human rights. And then finally, we talked about Hukuki Tayanch, which was formed by former political prisoners last April, but I may be missing one or two, but that's far too few. So we need to, I think, Dilmurod, by making those comparisons between Uzbekistan's neighbors and showing, again, we need to remind everyone that Uzbekistan joined the Human Rights Council just a few months ago, and it is a shame to be on that august body, and have these sorts of issues, along with all the other things we've been discussing on the podcast recently. I think this is the time, especially as we get closer to the elections. I know I keep mentioning that, for the OSCE to weigh in. They have a role to play on civil society in addition to the UN bodies that have already weighed in. And we should just make sure that message gets delivered and connected to every opportunity, every important event that happens. We need to talk about NGOs.
Yeah, Uzbekistan was way, way behind. Of course, here I'm not comparing Uzbekistan with Turkmenistan. That's not the comparison Uzbek authorities wants to be drawn. But earlier, the question I was asking to Dilmurod is, let me just state it here, and with that we will end the conversation here. The stats comes from 2018, where in Kyrgyzstan there are 28. Dilmurod, you know this better than me. There
I can tell
10,000.
So for 10,000 people in Kyrgyzstan, I calculated that there were more than 28 NGOs. In Kazakhstan, more than 12 NGOs. In Tajikistan, more than 3. And in Uzbekistan, less than 3 NGOs for 10,000 people. And if we take the number 10,000 like NGOs in Uzbekistan, including the Gongos, but if we exclude Gongos, we just focus on 3,000 self-initiative NGOs, it will be much less number than compared to our neighbors. So
yeah, it clearly shows.
That's why comparison with Turkmenistan is real. I'm not joking.
Yeah, there is a long way for Uzbekistan really to claim of any real progress, genuine progress in this field. So let's hope our next discussion about Uzbekistan to be in a little bit in an optimistic manner. With this, unfortunately, we have to conclude the discussion here. Thank you very much, Dilmurod Yusupov, a researcher at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, Steve Severlu, human rights lawyer and associate professor of the practice of human rights at the University of Southern California, and Dilmira Madyakubova, co-director of Uz Investigations and a fellow at the London-based Foreign Policy Center, and Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Europe Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi. Again, thank you very much, colleagues, for your time and thoughts today. And this is from me, Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free Europe Liberties media manager and host of the Majlis podcast here in Washington, D.C. Until next week, bye-bye.